Well, and I also hope that you are having a good evening so far. All right, so for today, we'll be doing our grade 5 English lesson on relative pronouns. So we'll be doing our grade 5 English lesson on relative pronouns. And before we start, we are going to, or as we're starting, we are going to log into aplusstudents.ca, and we're going to log in with our username as well as our password. And we're going to select the subject of language arts. Once we've selected the subject of language arts, and then we're going to grade 5, and we're going to scroll down up. We're going to scroll down the chapters up until we get to relative pronouns. Relative pronouns. Oopsie. So relative pronouns. I will. There we go. So we're going to choose relative pronouns on when we go to aplusstudents.ca, and we choose grade 5 relative pronouns. All right, so once we have selected this chapter of relative pronouns, the lessons that we are focusing on today is identifying relative pronouns. We're going to use relative pronouns such as who and whom, and we're going to use relative pronouns such as who, whom, which, and that. All right. So basically, a relative pronoun, right? It is a pronoun that connects a noun or a pronoun to an adjective clause. So a relative pronoun, it is a pronoun that either connects a noun or a pronoun to an adjective clause. And the relative pronouns that we have is who, whose, whom, which, that. So that is our relative pronouns. And the definitions of the relative pronouns are, if we use the relative pronoun who, right? If we use the relative pronoun who, then who is used for people replaces the subject pronoun such as I, she, he, we, and they. So who is basically used for people. And when we use it for people, then we replace the subject pronoun such as I, she, he, we, and they. All right. If we use whom, right? We use whom, which is WHOM, whom. Then it means that we replace the subject pronoun. So whom replaces the subject pronouns, which is me, her, and him. And then whose, when we use the word whose, then whose shows possession, like whose. Whose bowl is this, right? Whose plate, whose bowl, whose earrings are these? When we use which, which used for objects and animals. We use which to, and we use it for, it is used for objects and animals. So whose is to show position, which is used for objects and animals, and that is used for things. So this and that is used for things, which is used for objects and animals, and whose, it shows position. Then we have whom and who, that is basically used for people, and who replaces the subject pronouns such as I, she, he, we, and they, and whom replaces the subject pronoun me, her, and him. So that is relative pronoun definitions. If we now go to if we now go to aplusstudents.ca, our tutorial page, the first lesson that we're going to be focusing on is to identify the relative pronouns. So we are going to identify the relative pronouns. All right. So if we identify the relative pronouns, right, we see that a relative pronoun, it introduces a dependent or relative clause that describes a noun or pronoun. So a relative pronoun, it introduces a dependent or a relative clause that describes a noun or pronoun. And the five main relative pronouns are who, whom, whose, which, and that. And we basically gave the definition of each one of those also. So if we now go over a few examples of each one of the relative pronouns, or let's say with the relative pronouns included. The woman who lives next door. So the woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. Then the second one is Peter, whom you met yesterday, has four younger brothers. So if you now look at that two examples, which is the woman who lives next door, grows tomatoes in a garden, and then we have Peter, whom you met yesterday, as four younger brothers. So who lives next door? Whom you met. Then we have another example that says Emily, whose hair is quite long, likes wearing braids. Braids. So Emily, whose hair is quite long, likes wearing braids. So whose hair is quite long. I just read Janet's new book. So I just read Janet's new book, which came out last month. So I just read Janet's new book, which came out last month. Which. And this is the dress that I wore to my uncle's wedding. That I wore to my uncle's wedding. So basically, a relative pronoun, it introduces a dependent or a relative clause that describes a noun or pronoun. And then we have the five main relative pronouns, which is who, whom, whose, which, and that. And we went over the five examples where we made mention of the five relative pronouns that were sent back within the sentence. Sorry, within the sentence. So we said the woman who, you look at that word who, lives next door. That woman who is very busy, that lives next door, grows tomatoes in her garden. And then we have Peter, whom you met yesterday, whom you met yesterday, has four younger brothers. And then we have Emily, whose hair is quite long, likes wearing braids. And I just read Janet's new book, which came out last month. And this is the dress that I wore that to my uncle's wedding. So that I wore to my uncle's wedding. So these are the relative clauses as well as the examples. So now we are going to choose or identify, if that's the word that is being used, identify the relative pronouns. So if we look at the sentence that says, I am not familiar with that route that Bridget suggested. That route. Because Bridget suggested a route, and now someone is not familiar with that route. So which means that the pronoun that we are going to be using is that. It is that. So that Bridget suggested. Tristan has an excellent memory. So Tristan has an excellent memory, which serves him well in the test. So which serves him well on tests. So if he's got an excellent memory, then it definitely serves him well on his tests. So which, and then all right. Ronnie, who loves to experiment with new flavors, took cooking class in Thailand. So Ronnie, who? So we're going to say who loves to experiment, not whom loves to experiment. We'll say who loves to experiment with new flavors, took cooking classes in Thailand. So who is our relative pronoun? So that musical, which opened last week, earned glowing reviews. So that musical, which opened last week. So which opened last week, earned glowing reviews. So that musical, which opened last week. So we don't say that opened last week, which opened last week, earned glowing reviews. Not that, which. So we can say which being our relative pronoun. And then the people whose names were called. Remember, when it comes to who or whose, and then it refers to people, right? Who or whose refers to people. So the people whose names were called approached the counter eagerly. So the people whose names were called approached the counter eagerly. So whose names were called? So who? So the people whose names were called approached the counter eagerly. And once again, when it comes to who and whom, then you are referring to people. You're referring to people. So it's basically like the subject, right? Because if we go back, then we do say who as well as whom. Whom and whose. All right, let's go and do our test. All right, so we're going to select the pronoun, right? The relative pronoun. And yes, it seems like there's a lot of words, but it is basically just a sentence that has been broken up. So Bruce has an excellent memory, which serves him well on tests. So we need to select one of these words as a relative pronoun. So if you look at the words, which is Bruce has an excellent memory, which serves him well on tests. We need to choose one of those as the relative pronoun. And if we choose the relative pronoun, then which is the one? So which. So having a good memory is an advantage in that case. Ronnie, who loves to experiment with new flavors, took cooking classes in Thailand. So who is our relative pronoun? Ronnie, who loves to experiment new flavors, took cooking lessons in Thailand. So who? Lovely. We took a ferry to Ellis Island, which is a popular tourist spot. So we took a ferry to Ellis Island, which is a popular tourist spot. So we need to select the relative pronoun, and then we choose which is a popular tourist spot. So which is correct. So does the restaurant still serve the dessert that I like? So does the restaurant still serve the dessert, that I like? Does the restaurant serve dessert that I like? So that is our relative pronoun. So that is our relative pronoun. I'm not familiar with the route that Bridget suggested. So I am not familiar with the route that Bridget suggested. So we're going to say, I am not familiar with the route that, so that Bridget suggested. So that Bridget suggested. Because remember, we only use who, whom, that, which for now. Are the library books that I checked out due already? So are the library books that I checked out due already? And if we were to choose our relative pronoun, that, all right. And are you happy with the people whom we elected? Whom we elected? Nope or yes. So whom is correct? So we're going to say Miss Benson is a lawyer who specializes in labor law. So a lawyer, remember we said that when we use words like who and whom, then it is referring to people. So who? So she is a lawyer and she specializes in labor law. So Miss Benson is a lawyer who specializes in labor law. So we don't say that specializes, who specializes in labor law. And did you help the traveler whose suitcase was lost? Did you help the traveler whose suitcase was lost? And whose is whose is correct. It's a relative pronoun. All right, so now we're going to use relative pronouns such as who and whom. So we're going to explain the sentence with the best relative pronoun, right? So before we do that, a relative pronoun, once again, it introduces a dependent or relative, right? So an independent clause that describes a noun or a pronoun. And the relative pronouns who and whom, they give information about people. That is why I was saying when it comes to who and whom, it tells us about people. So it gives us more information about people. So if you see who or whom, then you must know it is basically directly related to people. And to figure out whether to use who or whom, we need to restate the dependent clause with a personal pronoun. And if the clause uses a subject pronoun such as he, she, or they, then we use who. So, which means that if we use who, then the pronoun needs to be he, she, or they. And if the clause uses an object pronoun, him, her, or them, we use whom. All right. The woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. And we say that who, it refers to people. It gives us information about people. The lady who lives next door. What does she do? She grows tomatoes in her garden. This is basically information that we are getting about the woman or about the lady, right? And the information that we're getting about her is the fact that she lives next door. And then we have Peter, whom you met yesterday, has four younger brothers. Whom you met yesterday has four younger brothers. So when it comes to us identifying the relative pronoun, then we choose whom, and we also said whom it refers to or gives us information about people. About Peter, who lives next door, who you met yesterday, sorry, he has four younger brothers. And even when we use who, it tells us about the lady that lives next door. So basically, when it comes to who or whom, we need to restate the dependent clause with the personal pronoun. All right. So now we're going to complete the sentence with the best relative pronoun. Miss Mendoza consulted the accountant. Her business partner suggested. So Miss Mendoza consulted the accountant. Her business partner suggested. So we need to choose the correct relative pronoun. So Miss Mendoza consulted the accountant. Her business partner suggested. Are we going to choose who her business partner suggested or whom? So we can say she consulted the accountant, whom her business partner suggested. So, whom is the relative pronoun. I'm wary of Dakota. I don't completely trust. Do we say who I don't completely trust or whom? Who or whom? And if we look at or if we select the correct one, then we will say that I am wary of Dakota, whom I don't completely trust. So, whom is our relative pronoun? Whom. And here they even say that the dependent clause gives information about a person. So, whom is the correct one? All right, the next one is an award will go to the person who collects the most pledges. An award will go to the person who collects the most pledges. Do we say who collects the most pledges or whom? And if we were to choose the correct one, we will say who. So, who is the correct one? So, an award will go to the person who collects the most pledges. And we specifically chose who because the dependent clause gives us information about the person. Remember, we said when it comes to who or whom, then we have information about either people or we get information about the person, right? And then we also need to, and then you can even restate the dependent clause with the subject pronoun. All right. So who? So when we use who and whom as a relative pronoun, right, then it basically gives us information about the person. So we get information about the person. That is when we use who or whom as the relative pronoun. And once again, a relative pronoun, it introduces a dependent or a relative clause, right? That describes a noun or a pronoun. So who or whom, which gives us information about people. All right. So now we're gonna go to our test. We're going to complete the sentence with the best relative pronoun. So a person is the person who has a toothache should consult a dentist immediately, or a person whom has a toothache should consult a dentist immediately. So who or whom? We need to select the correct relative pronoun. Is it whom or who? So a person who has a toothache should consult a dentist immediately, or a person whom has a toothache should consult a dentist immediately. All right, so we are now going to choose our relative pronoun. So we're going to say a person who has, see, so a person who has a toothache should consult a dentist immediately. So who has a toothache? So if you have, which is who, then you should consult. So well done. The Olympic divers represent the United States will likely earn medals. So is it who or whom represent the United States will likely earn medals? The Olympic divers, do we say who represents the United States will likely earn medals, or whom represents the United States will likely earn medals? We need to choose the correct relative pronoun, either who or whom. Remember, who or whom, it gives us information about people. All right, let us choose the one that was chosen. So the Olympic divers, let's say who represents the United States will likely earn medals. And who is correct? So well done. The chef, is it whom I took a cooking lesson from, studied in Paris, or the chef who I took a cooking lesson from, studied in Paris? So the chef whom I took cooking lessons from, studied in Paris, or the chef who I took cooking lessons from, studied in Paris? Whom or who? So, the chef who I took cooking lessons from studied in Paris. So, let us choose one of the relative pronouns. All right, let's go with the crowd. So, which is whom? Because we took lessons from the chef. So, well done. And I am wary of Dakota. So, I'm wary of Dakota, who I don't completely trust or whom I don't completely trust. I'm wary of Dakota, who or whom I don't completely trust. So this is Dakota, and I do not trust her. So I'm wary of Dakota, who I don't completely trust or whom I don't completely trust. We need to find or select the the correct relative pronoun to complete the sentence. who or whom. So when we choose the base relative pronoun to complete the sentence, we will say that I'm wary of Dakota, who I don't completely trust. So if we have a situation where we get an answer incorrect, don't worry. All you can do is if you get a answer incorrect, you can go to the answer, copy the link, forward it to us, and we will give you 100 bonus points. Sometimes it can be a bit tricky, especially when it comes to relative pronouns, who and whom, right? But don't worry, we are so proud of you. All right, so let's go back and do the last one. So we're going to use relative pronouns who, whom, whose, which, and that. But well done, well done. So we said relative pronouns, it introduces a dependent clause, right, that describes a noun or a pronoun, right? And we have our main relative pronouns, which is who, whose, which, and we have whose and that. So that is the five main relative pronouns, right? And the relative pronouns, which is who and whom, it gives us information about people. And now we also have the relative pronoun that gives necessary information about things, right? Necessary information narrows down what you're talking about and is not set off by commas, right? So if we look at our example here, we walked to a park that has a tire, right? A tire swing. We walked to a park that has a tire swing. So when it comes to that, right, it is not necessarily set off by commas, especially that is not set off by commas. Whom and who you will still find that is set off by commas, but not that, especially if we use the word that or the relative pronoun that. The information narrows down which park we walk to, and it is necessary, right? So it's like specifying. So we walk to the park that has a swing tire, which means that if you go to a specific park and it does not have a swing tire, then of course that is not the one that we made mention of. Then we have relative pronouns, which adds unnecessary information about things. Unnecessary information about things. And this extra information does not narrow down what you are talking about. It needs to be set off by commas. It is always set off by commas. We walked to Glendale Park, which has a tire swing. So, which is always set off by commas. So, comma, which. And this information is extra. That is why they're saying it is giving unnecessary information. So this information is extra and it does not narrow down which park we walked to. All right. So that is basically who and whom's that we identified so far. We identified which. And now the last one. Information is extra. It doesn't narrow down which park we will go to. Okay. So now the relative pronoun whose, it shows position, shows who it belongs to, right? It shows position, like Emily's hair. So Emily, whose hair is quite long, likes to wear braids. So sometimes when it comes to whose, which is WHOSE, we should not confuse that with whose. Because whose, which is WHO apostrophe S, is a contraction. Who is or who has. And it does not show position. So Emily, who's quite tall, meaning it's like saying Emily, who is quite tall, can reach the top shelf. It does not have anything to do with position. So that is basically the five relative pronouns broken down with examples. And with the relative pronouns, we said it introduces a dependent or relative clause that describes a noun or pronoun. And please do not get confused with whose and who. Who and whom. It basically gives us information about people that specifies something, which is basically extra information that is given, and whose it shows position. All right, so that is basically the end of our lesson on relative pronouns. So, grade fives, thank you very much for joining our class. You should have an amazing evening and weekend further. Goodbye.